We've all seen the paintings, the soft light, the silk cushions, the scented oils, the languid bodies of beautiful women, the fantasy of the Ottoman harem, a paradise of pleasure for one man. But behind the gilded screens and the mother-of-pearl inlay is a machine of flesh and power, engineered with brutal precision. In the 16th century, under the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, this machine reached its peak efficiency. Its purpose was not pleasure, it was survival. The survival of an empire built on a system so cold, so calculated, it will chill you to the bone. We are told stories of love, like that of Suleiman and his wife, Hurrem Sultan, but we are not told how that love was forged in a system of absolute sexual control, where a single night could lead to a throne or a silk cord around your son's neck. This is the truth of the 5 most horrifying sexual practices of Suleiman's harem. Not horrifying for their depravity, but for their chilling, bureaucratic logic. If you value documented history like this, researched from the ground up, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this story. This isn't fantasy or Orientalist fiction. This is history, drawn from the meticulous research of scholars like Leslie P. Pierce, whose 1993 book, The Imperial Harem, Women and Sovereignty in the Ottoman Empire, pulled back the curtain using actual Ottoman archival records. We're also drawing from the specific ledgers and Venetian diplomatic reports analyzed by historians like Godfrey Goodwin. This is the system, as they documented it. Now back to the information. First, the procurement. Before a woman could ever lie in the Sultan's bed, she had to be acquired. And she was never, ever a volunteer. You are a girl of 12, maybe 14, living in a village in Ruthenia, in the Polish kingdom, what is now Western Ukraine. The year is 1522. Life is hard, but it is your own. You hear the screams first, then the thunder of hooves, Crimean Tatar raiders, the wolf pack of the Black Sea storming your home. For centuries, these raids, known as the harvesting of the steppe, were a constant terror. They are the primary suppliers for the Istanbul slave markets, a vital part of the Ottoman economy. They are not gentle. Your family is cut down, you're bound, thrown over a horse, and taken on a brutal journey south. This is the start of a long, dehumanizing pipeline. You march for weeks, chained to other captives, towards the great Crimean port of Kaffa. The city is one of the world's biggest slave markets. Here, the process becomes chillingly commercial. You are stripped, inspected by merchants and palace agents, your teeth checked, your limbs examined, your health assessed like livestock, your prices haggled over. A young, healthy, beautiful girl is a premium commodity. Once sold, you are packed into the suffocating, diseased hold of a ship for the journey across the Black Sea to the imperial capital, Istanbul. Other girls come from the Caucasus, Circassians, Georgians, prized for their pale skin and fine features, often sold by their own impoverished families. Others are captured by Barbary corsairs, the feared pirates of the Mediterranean, who raid the coasts of Italy, Spain, and even as far as Ireland. Some are by gifts, human tribute paid by foreign dignitaries or provincial governors, a demonstration of loyalty to the Sultan. No matter the source, the destination is the same. Upon arrival at the Topkapi Palace, your old life is systematically incinerated. Your name is erased. You are forbidden from speaking your native language. Your Christian faith is replaced with mandatory instruction in Islam. You are now a Kariye, a concubine in training. And you are given a new Turkish name, something poetic like Gulbahar, Spring Rose, or Mahidevran, Moon of Fortune. This renaming is a core part of the psychological reprogramming. Your past self is now a ghost. You undergo years of rigorous education, but this is not an education for your benefit. It is the programming of an imperial asset. You learn to speak and write Ottoman Turkish flawlessly. You learn the intricate rules of palace etiquette, how to walk, how to speak, how to serve your superiors without error. You are taught to play musical instruments, to dance, to sing, to recite Persian poetry, and you are taught the art of being a woman in this unique world, how to be alluring, graceful, and pleasing to the Sultan. This was the likely path of Hurrem Sultan herself, the woman who would one day rule the empire at Suleiman's side. Captured around the year 1520, she was just one of thousands upon thousands of women whose lives were stolen to feed the imperial machine. Her entire world was burned to the ground, so she could become a single, shimmering jewel in the Sultan's collection. That is the first step, a foundation of absolute violence and the complete annihilation of identity. Second, the reproductive hierarchy. Once inside the harem, you enter a brutal, silent war. A ladder of flesh where the only way up is through the Sultan's bed. The harem in Topkapi Palace is a city within a city, a labyrinth of over 400 rooms. You begin your life in the courtyard of the concubines, sharing dormitories with dozens of other girls. At the bottom of this world are the hundreds of Karye, the novices. Most would live and die in the harem without ever being seen by the Sultan. They were the staff, the servants to the more senior women, their days filled with chores and lessons. The entire institution was ruled by the Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan. During the early part of Suleiman's reign, this was Hafsa Sultan, a woman of immense power and authority. She, along with the chief eunuch, managed every aspect of harem life. It was she who vetted the new girls, who decided which ones were promising enough to receive special training, and ultimately, which ones might be presented to her son. To be noticed was the first miracle. If the Sultan, during a visit or a harem festivity, showed the slightest interest in you, perhaps by dropping a handkerchief before you, as legend has it, your life changed instantly. You became a gozda, the favored one. You were immediately separated from the other girls and moved to better quarters. A small army of servants would descend upon you. A ritual of bathing in the palace hammam, of hair removal, of perfuming and being dressed in the finest silks and jewels would begin. This could last for hours. You would then be led by the chief eunuch down a specific hallway, known as the Golden Road, to the Sultan's private chambers. This was not a romantic encounter. It was a state function, a highly choreographed ceremony called halvet. After the night was over, if the Sultan was pleased, he would send you gifts of gold or precious fabrics. If you spent one night with the Sultan and never saw him again, your status was slightly elevated, but your life remained largely unchanged. But if he called for you again, you became an Iqbal, the fortunate. Your daily allowance of silver coins, your akshay, increased dramatically. You were given a private apartment, your own slaves to command. But the true prize, the only one that mattered for ultimate power, was pregnancy. If you conceived a child, and that child was a son, you ascended to the rank of Kedin, or Haseki. You were now one of the most powerful women in the empire. You commanded a huge staff, a vast income, and had direct access to the Sultan. This was the entire purpose of the harem's sexual structure, the production of male heirs. The Ottoman dynasty did not follow primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits. Any son of the Sultan was a potential heir. This set up a deadly competition between the mothers. Under Suleiman's predecessors, a policy of one mother, one son, was often practiced to prevent any single woman from gaining too much power. But Suleiman shattered this tradition for Hurrem. She bore him not one, but 5 sons, Mehmed, Abdullah, Selim, Bayezid, and Kihangir. Then, in an act that stunned the empire, Suleiman freed her from slavery and formally married her in 1534. This was a revolution. For centuries, sultans had not married, precisely to avoid creating a powerful rival family of in-laws. By making Hurrem his legal wife, he elevated her above all other women, creating for her the new title of Haseki Sultan. For every Hurrem, Saon. There were hundreds of other women whose lives were a quiet dead end. A girl who bore a daughter received a brief elevation in status, but she was out of the game of succession. Her daughter was a political asset to be married off, not a future ruler. A woman who never conceived simply faded into the background. The entire system was a ruthless biological tournament, and the bed of the Sultan was the arena. Your body was not your own. It was the property of the dynasty, a womb in service to the empire. If you value documented history like this, pulled from the archives and presented without the fantasy, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. And please, comment from which city you're hearing this from. The reality of this system is preserved in the Ottoman treasury logs, the Maliyedin Müdever Defterleri, which meticulously record the daily stipends for every woman in the harem, ranked by her proximity to the Sultan's body and her reproductive success. This is not a story, it is an accounting of human capital. Now back to the details. Third, the guardians. The entire structure of the harem, this pressurized container of sexual politics, was impossible to maintain without a very specific kind of jailer. Men who could be trusted implicitly with hundreds of the world's most beautiful women, men who could not physically betray the Sultan. The eunuchs. Their existence is one of the most brutal aspects of the entire system. They were slaves, captured as young boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 12. The white eunuchs were often from the Caucasus, Georgians or Circassians, or from conquered Christian lands of the Balkans. They served in the palace school, the Indiran, and guarded the harem's exterior. The black eunuchs were captured in raids or purchased in markets from regions like Sudan, Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, and they controlled the harem's interior. The boys were then subjected to a horrific procedure, full castration, an operation that removed all external genitalia. It was performed in crude conditions by specialists, often Coptic priests in Egypt. The mortality rate from hemorrhage and infection was staggering, perhaps as high as 80%. Those who survived were forever changed, physically and psychologically. They could never grow a beard. Their voices remained high-pitched. Their bone structure often developed differently, leading to long limbs and a characteristic stoop. They were outsiders, belonging to neither the world of men nor the world of women. This was the point. Their loyalty was, in theory, absolute to the Sultan and the institution they served. Once in the palace, they too entered a rigid hierarchy and received an extensive education. They were taught to read, write, and manage accounts. They studied theology and law. They were not just guards, they were administrators. The white eunuchs, led by the Kappa Asa, were historically the more powerful group. He was controlling the palace school where the empire's future leaders were trained. But the inner sanctum, the world of the women, was the exclusive domain of the black eunuchs. They were the ones who interacted with the concubines daily, who managed their lives, delivered messages, and enforced the rigid rules. At their head was the Qizlar Aso, the chief black eunuch. Over time, particularly after Suleiman's reign, this position would become one of the most powerful in the entire Ottoman Empire. He controlled the harem's vast wealth and properties, including the hugely profitable pious endowments, or waqfs, established by the imperial women. This gave him immense financial power. He was the essential liaison between the Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, and the outside world, including the Grand Vizier. His power could make or break careers. He arranged promotions. He arranged punishments. He saw everything. He heard everything. These men, scarred and broken in their youth, became the silent, watchful pillars of the imperial cage. Their creation was an act of profound violence, a necessary horror to maintain the integrity of the dynastic bloodline. They were the ghosts in the machine. Fourth, the inevitable outcome, the entire system of sexual competition, of mothers pushing their sons as the favored heir, had a single, terrifying endgame: fratricide. The law of fratricide was the bloody cornerstone of Ottoman stability. Because any son of the Sultan could claim the throne, the death of a ruler often triggered devastating civil wars as brothers fought each other for power, weakening the empire at its most vulnerable moment. To prevent this, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, formalized a brutal solution in the late 15th century. His law code stated, "For the well-being of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the Sultanate may lawfully execute his brothers." This wasn't seen as murder. It was a state necessity, a terrible but vital act to prevent the empire from tearing itself apart. The harem was the breeding ground for this conflict. The mothers of the princes, the Khaduns, were not just rivals for the Sultan's affection. They were political factions, constantly scheming to ensure their own son would be the one to survive. During Suleiman's reign, concubines, this deadly game played out in spectacular fashion between his first consort day, Mahidevran, the mother of the brilliant and popular Prince Shehzade Mustafa, and his wife, Hurrem Sultan. Mustafa was the eldest, the most experienced, a gifted commander, and a favorite of the elite Janissary corps. The Venetian ambassador Bernardo Navaggero wrote in 1553 that it is impossible to describe how much he is loved and desired by all as successor to the throne. He was, by all accounts, the perfect heir, but Hurrem was relentless. For decades, she and her political allies, including her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, worked to poison Suleiman's mind against his firstborn son. They whispered of Mustafa's ambition, of his popularity with the army, framing it not as a strength, but as a direct threat to Suleiman's rule. They intercepted and likely forged letters, making it seem as though Mustafa was in treasonous correspondence with the Safavid Shah of Persia. In the year 1553, during a campaign against Safavid Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent in the Oregli Valley. Sagas and historical accounts describe the scene with chilling detail. Mustafa was disarmed before entering, a grave insult. He entered the vast imperial tent, expecting to greet his father, but found only empty chambers. As he passed through the final screen, he was set upon by the royal executioners, the deaf-mutes who carried out the dynasty's silent work. Because royal blood could not be spilled on the ground, strangulation with a silk cord was the required method. They seized Mustafa, a powerful warrior, and, after a violent struggle, murdered him on the orders of his own father. Suleiman reportedly watched from behind a screen. Immediately after, Mustafa's own young son, his only male heir, was also executed in Bursa, wiping his line from existence. Mustafa's death cleared the path to the throne for Hurrem's sons, Selim and Bayezid. The harem's sexual politics had reached their logical conclusion, but the cycle was not over. After Hurrem's death in 1558, her two surviving sons immediately began their own civil war, culminating in Suleiman ordering the execution of his other son, Bayezid, and his 4 grandsons in 1561. A mother's victory was not just securing the Sultan's favor, it was ensuring her son lived by guaranteeing his rivals died. The silk sheets of the Sultan's bed were inextricably tied to the silk cord of the executioner. 5th, the final destination. What happened to the women who lost this game? What was the fate of a concubine who never caught the Sultan's eye, or who bore only a daughter, or whose son was executed? Or, most commonly, the entire harem of a sultan who died, leaving the throne to his successor. They were not set free. They were not pensioned off to a comfortable retirement. They were discarded. Their destination was a place known as the Eski Saray, the old palace, located in the heart of Istanbul on the site of the original Forum of Theodosius. It was the first palace built by the Ottomans after the conquest. By Suleiman's time, it had become a gilded cage for forgotten women. It was sometimes called the Palace of Tears. When a sultan died, his entire harem, his mothers, his sisters, his daughters, and all his concubines, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, were bundled into covered carriages and transported to the old palace under the guard of eunuchs. There, they would live out the rest of their days in isolation and obscurity. They were still state property, supported by the treasury, but they were stripped of all power, all influence, all hope of ever returning to the center of the world at Topkapi. Life in the old palace was a living death. It was a community of women whose only shared future was the past. They were surrounded by the ghosts of their ambitions and their lost sons. The mother of an executed prince, like Mahidevran, faced an even bleaker fate. After Mustafa's murder in 1553, she was exiled to Bursa, the old Ottoman capital. She was stripped of her status and her substantial income. The sources tell us she was forced to sell her remaining possessions simply to survive. Her name was erased from the official court registers at Topkapi. She was a non-person. It was only years later, after Hurrem was dead and Suleiman too, that Hurrem's son, Selim II, finally ascended the throne. He located Mahidevran, living in squalor, and granted her a pension, allowing her to live out her final years with some dignity and to build a tomb for her murdered son. Her story is the perfect cautionary tale of how precarious life was, even at the highest level. Another fate for a less significant concubine was to be used as a political pawn. After years of service, if she had failed to rise in the ranks, she might be gifted in marriage to a loyal pasha or a provincial governor. This wasn't an act of kindness, it was a calculated political move. A woman from the Imperial Harem brought with her unparalleled knowledge of the court's inner workings, its factions, and its personalities. Marrying her to a powerful official was a way for the central government to place a loyal, observant agent in a powerful provincial household. She was an instrument of surveillance as much as a wife. Her life's next chapter, dictated entirely by the needs of the state. To be chosen by the Sultan was a 1 in 1,000 chance at ultimate power, but to fail was to be erased, to be consigned to a silent, featureless existence, a ghost haunting the corridors of a forgotten palace, your name slowly fading from the ledgers and from memory. The fantasy of the harem is one of choice, of languid pleasure and romance. The reality, recorded in the palace archives, is one of cold, hard numbers. We know that in the year 1552, the daily payroll for the women of the harem was 6,246 silver akshay. We know that Hurrem Sultan's personal stipend was 2,000 akshay per day, a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest individuals in the empire. In contrast, a novice, Kariya, might receive only a handful of coins. Every meal, every bolt of silk, every bar of soap was accounted for. The archives show us purchase orders for hundreds of tons of rice, thousands of chickens, and mountains of sugar to feed the institution. This wasn't a den of iniquity. It was a state-run, meticulously budgeted government department whose sole product was legitimate heirs. The lives of thousands of women were managed, quantified, and controlled with the same bureaucratic precision as the imperial mint or the state armory. Every sexual encounter was a potential entry in the dynastic ledger. Every birth, a credit or a debit. Every death, a balancing of the books. The most horrifying part of Suleiman's harem was not imagined cruelty, but its chilling, systematic, and documented efficiency. The ink on the account books is just as indelible as the blood on the silk cord.